Demon Souls, originally released in February of 2009 for the PlayStation 3, was remade for the PlayStation 5 and released in November of 2020, retailing for $69.99, but can frequently be found cheaper. When I reviewed Dark Souls 2, I said it was the weakest of FromSoftware's Souls games. Demon Souls is the game that would be directly above it. And while I wanted to review this a long time ago, I didn't have a way to record PlayStation 3 footage, so I had to wait till I could get my hands on a PlayStation 5. While this version looks considerably nicer than the original, most of it is a very faithful remake. This was the first Souls game. That being the case, many of the ideas seem more like prototype or beta versions of what would come later. Instead of a sprawling interconnected world, we have a central hub that is connected to 5 separate worlds. We have a complete lack of any kind of poise system for when getting hit. We have a complicated system known as world and character tendency, in which the worlds get harder the more you die in them when in human form, but become easier as you beat bosses without dying in human form. And if you don't want your deaths to impact world tendency, well, you can always play in ghost form. Of course, then you're going to sacrifice half of your health. And to make things more complicated, there are events that take place in all 5 worlds that only happen when it is darkest or lightest. So if you're a completionist, things are going to get very complicated very quickly for you. You might notice that this tendency mechanic has never been repeated. But not everything here is more complicated. Enemies and bosses are generally simpler in how they behave. Upgrading weapons here is also a little more complicated, as every upgrade path for your weapons has different materials associated with it, and getting these materials is random. And the highest end version of these materials drop off of enemies that have a limited number of spawns. So it is a real possibility that you might not be able to upgrade your weapon of choice to its full potential. But it isn't all a series of annoyances. Leveling, for example, is about what you would expect, with one key difference. While yes, the cost to level up each stat point goes up exponentially as the game goes on, each stat point actually does more for you, as no matter what you upgrade, you get defensive stats in addition to the primary focus of that stat. This means that even if you put all of your stats into magic or faith for a caster build, you will still receive fairly substantial defensive bonuses. This has the side effect of making armor far less important than it is in later Souls games. Enemies and bosses also behave in more simplistic, predictable ways. No boss fight in this game has multiple phases. All bosses will act exactly the same at full health as they do when they only have one sliver left. And it's worth noting that if you're in ghost form when you beat a boss, you will be restored to human form. And if you're worried about world tendency, you might want to go back to the hub world and fall off something really high, so your death doesn't darken any of the worlds. This game is also a little bit more grind-heavy than later Souls games would be. This is because you don't have a healing item that restores at checkpoints. Instead, you have Moongrass. It comes in many varieties that restore different amounts of health. You can either buy it off of vendors, or you can get it as drops off of enemies. So if you're struggling with part of the game or a boss, at a certain point, you will have to go farm more grass. Other than that, things are widely how you would expect them to be from a Souls game. Upon any death, you leave your souls behind, and you can only reclaim them by getting back to where you died. But die a second time before reclaiming them, and your souls are gone. Each of the worlds has a few different checkpoints in it, and there's usually a shortcut to be unlocked to shorten the distance between these checkpoints. And there are NPCs in every world. Unfortunately, sometimes these NPCs will be killed by the enemies in that world, as some of them like to roam around. And if you're not keeping your eye on that NPC, they might get to some enemies you haven't dealt with yet. This can only happen to a few NPCs, but it's still worth noting, and can be frustrating if you're trying to do the various side quests. And of course, once you finally finish the game, you can move on to New Game Plus, where everything is a little bit harder. Enemies hit harder, have more health, and take less damage, but also drop more souls. And any NPCs that died will be back. It's worth noting that the PS5 remake also added a feature called Fractured World, which flips the right and left of the world. This has its own secrets to be unlocked, and is a nice way to play the game if you played a lot of the PlayStation 3 version, as flipping the world like that makes more of a difference than you think it would. So, is Demon Souls worth your time? If you are a fan of FromSoftware's Souls titles, it absolutely is, as this shows you the roots of the series. While it is a much more rough experience than what would come later, it still possesses the core of what is good about a Souls game. If you still have a PlayStation 3 sitting around, you can easily find the original version for under $10. As for the PS5 version, while it still goes for $70 on the PSN store, you can find it physically at retail shops for much less than that. It can easily be found for $50 or even $40. And while I wouldn't recommend buying a PlayStation 5 specifically to play the Demon Souls remake, it is one of the more worthwhile experiences to have that is exclusive to the PlayStation 5. Please do like, comment, subscribe, and tell your friends.